We are going to move to the second talk, to this first block about causal inference in practice. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Jamilla Cooiman, who basically founded CausAI. So you probably all or many of you know her because she's posting daily on LinkedIn about causal inference, and she has been doing this consistently for years. At least I've seen your posts and followed you closely. And now you have many courses. You taught courses on how to use causal inference in business to companies, and you have a platform where you share these courses. But today, you're here to share your experience and what should be basically the first steps and how can we start basically building this capacity in companies, which is a very exciting question. So now I leave you the floor. You can share your slides and looking forward to your presentation.
So thanks a lot, Quinten, for the nice introduction and for having me at this event. So yeah, for everybody who doesn't know me yet, my name is Jamilla. I'm the owner of CausAI, which is a company focused on training in causal inference, where I mainly do this through online courses and in-company training for data teams. Now, I've been doing this work for about 2.5 years now, and over that time, I've seen a strong increase in interest in causal inference. So more data professionals want to learn causal inference, and more organizations are starting to explore whether causal inference can be useful for them. But at the same time, I've also experienced that actual adoption of causal inference in business settings is still lagging behind. In other words, there's still a gap between interest in causal inference and the extent to which businesses are actually using it in practice. And in today's talk, I want to focus a bit more on that gap. More specifically, I want to discuss what it takes for companies to move from being interested in causal inference to actually using it in practice. So the way I think about this is that there are basically two layers of the organization that play an important role in whether this adoption actually happens. The first layer is the practitioner layer. These are basically the data scientists and other analytics professionals who need to actually apply causal inference in practice. And the second layer is the leadership layer. These are basically the managers and the stakeholders that determine what gets prioritized in the organization, how the teams can spend their time, and yeah, basically whether causal inference actually gets space in the day-to-day work. And in my experience, adoption of causal inference can actually stall at both of these layers, but for different reasons. So what I want to do in today's talk is first discuss the main challenge that I see at each of these layers that can stall adoption. And afterwards, I'm going to discuss an adoption strategy we can use in business to overcome both of these challenges. So I want to start by focusing on the practitioner layer. If I had to summarize the main challenge that I see at this layer, it would be that sometimes practitioners don't yet see how they can realistically make use of causal inference under the constraints of a business setting. Let me explain what I mean by that. In my experience, when analysts are first introduced to causal inference, they often see quite quickly that it can be relevant for their work. Usually, these analysts are working on problems like pricing or product optimization or marketing, something like that. And ultimately, many of these problems are about understanding cause and effect. So they quite quickly see that it can be relevant for them, which in principle is a very good starting point for adoption. Nevertheless, what I tend to experience is that they struggle to see how to realistically work with causal inference in a business setting. And I think that there are two main reasons for that. The first reason is that the causal inference skills aren't always there yet, and developing these skills takes time, which isn't always available in a business setting. So usually these analysts are already working on many other projects and other priorities in the organization. And it can be really difficult to find the time and the space to work on causal inference alongside all this other work that they already have to do, especially if upskilling in causal inference isn't yet prioritized in the organization. The second reason is that even for the practitioners that do have some causal inference skills, it can sometimes still be difficult to see how they can realistically apply this to their own business use cases. This is especially the case when people have mainly learned causal inference through their own effort rather than as part as like an adoption process in the organization. Because in these settings, these people usually have learned from books and online resources. And although that is great, I do tend to experience that when these people try to apply what they learned to their own business use cases, that they can still really struggle to make that bridge. And I think that the main reason for this is that real business use cases are typically a lot messier than the examples that people learn from. So suddenly they have to think about the causal design themselves. They have to think about violated assumptions. They have to deal with imperfect data environments and so on. And if causal inference isn't yet prioritized in the organization, it can be really difficult to find the time and the support to work through those issues. So yeah, together these two things make it that some practitioners can't really see how they can realistically work with causal inference in their business setting, which is of course a major hurdle for adoption. Let's now focus on the leadership layer. So if I had to summarize the main challenge that I see at this layer, it would be that leadership doesn't always see enough value in causal inference to justify the investment that they think it would take to adopt it in the organization. Let me again explain what I mean here. In my experience, usually the investment is quite clear to see for leadership. So in my experience, they see quite easily that upskilling in causal inference will take time for the teams to learn causal inference, time to practice with causal inference, and also apply it to their own business use cases. And usually they know that there will be some sort of involvement of a causal inference expert as well. So the investment is quite clear to see for them. However, what I tend to experience is that the value of causal inference isn't always as clear to them. And basically, to truly see the value of causal inference, leadership will have to see that many of the business questions that they care about are causal in nature, that their current way of analyzing them is not always sufficient to address them, and also that without causal inference, they're basically making important decisions without really understanding their impact. It is not as simple as just showing like an improvement in a metric, like predictive accuracy or something, because it's basically a lot more fundamental than that. It is about understanding that causal inference will give the organization important information that it is currently lacking, which is information about the effectiveness of decisions. And to truly understand this, leadership needs to have at least a basic level of causal literacy. And if that causal literacy isn't there yet, the value of causal inference may not feel tangible enough for them to justify the investment that they think it would take to adopt it in the organization. And that can, of course, be a major hurdle for adoption as well. Okay, so now that we've discussed some of the main challenges I see behind adopting causal inference in business, I want to move on to what can help. So in my view, to adopt causal inference effectively in business, we need to make use of an adoption strategy that does two things at the same time. From the practitioner side, it is important that this strategy will keep the gap between the causal inference techniques that people learn and the causal inference problems that they work on as small as possible. This will basically help to keep the learning maximally relevant. And at the same time, it will also help to prevent that situation where the practitioners become demotivated because they see this massive gap between theory and practice. From the leadership side, it is important that the strategy can start with minimal effort and that it can help to make the value of causal inference more tangible relatively quickly. This will basically make it a lot easier for management to say yes to starting the adoption process and making some space for causal inference in the organization. Because the initial barrier is just a lot lower. A good way to achieve this is to run what I would call a small causal adoption pilot. And this would basically look as follows. First, the team selects one real and relevant causal business problem to work on. This could, for example, be a problem where we want to understand the effectiveness of a small campaign that we recently did, or a problem where we want to understand the effectiveness of a new policy change in the company, or basically some other use case where we want to understand impact. And ideally, this is a problem that we would usually approach with non-causal methods, because that way the team can later contrast the usual analysis with the causal analysis and really sort of show the added value that causal inference can bring. And I think that helps to make the value a lot more tangible for management. After that, the organization selects a small group of motivated practitioners to work on this problem. And if the goal here is to keep this initial pilot small, this could really just be 2 or 3 motivated analysts, which will help to keep the investment limited. This small group will then build the skills needed to approach this business problem. Usually this will be the stage where there would be some involvement of a causal inference expert, because that person will help to build the skills of the team and at the same time also help review the analysis and the results. If there's someone available internally in the organization that has deep causal inference expertise, then that is a very good option because that person, usually understands the business context very well. But if that person isn't available, you can also hire an external expert, which could, for example, run a dedicated workshop on a workflow that is appropriate for the business problem and help review the analysis and the results. And then finally, once the team has worked through this initial causal pilot, it's time to share the results with the relevant management. So this shouldn't be like a deep technical presentation of the method. Of course, there should be some coverage of the estimation techniques used. But the main focus here should be on demonstrating the value that causal inference adds. What would the usual analysis have shown? What does the causal analysis show? What kind of information do we get now that we didn't have before? And why does this matter for our business decision making? I really think that that kind of discussion can make the value of causal inference a lot more tangible for management, because instead of hearing in a general or abstract way why causal inference matters, they can now sort of see the value that it adds in their own business context. And once that value of causal inference becomes more concrete and tangible to them, it is also much easier to continue this adoption process, because in principle, the organization can now select another relevant business problem and approach it in exactly the same way. And then adoption can grow gradually from there. I think that an adoption strategy like this can work well for a few reasons. First of all, it lowers the entry barrier a lot. So causal inference adoption really doesn't have to start as like this massive transformation where entire teams change how they work immediately. It can really just start with one real problem, a small group of motivated practitioners, and just a limited first application. And I think that would make it a lot easier for management to say yes. Second, it makes the value of causal inference more visible because it shows what causal inference adds in the context of a problem that the organization already cares about. And finally, it makes the adoption of causal inference skills easier for the practitioners, because instead of first learning causal inference methods in general and then needing to figure out how to apply it to their own business problems, they now really learn how to approach one of their own business questions with an appropriate causal workflow. And I think that can really help to keep the gap between theory and practice small for them. So ultimately, I think that the exact adoption strategy that works best for each organization is, of course, dependent on the organization and the people that are involved. But overall, I do think that there's a better chance of moving from interest to adoption if we can basically keep the initial investment small, if we can keep the skill development maximally relevant, and if we can make the value of causal inference more tangible early on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Honestly, it's one of the biggest question I've witnessed, and you laid out a very precise plan that I've never seen elsewhere. So it's very clear and hopefully very useful for many, because indeed you face this issue that sometimes, and maybe you want to build on this, that technical staff usually know they need it, but they don't have the money or decision power. And then you have the people who do have, like executive, CFO, whatever, who have the decision and the money. And it's not easy to bridge this gap, but you laid out a very precise plan. And by providing value and showing it. Also, before I ask you a question from the audience, to anyone you can read, I just put a reference in the chat, Estimating the Value of Evidence-Based Decision Making, which is a recent preprint by top scholar in Causal Inference. And basically, they take a stab at trying to quantify exactly this, the value of evidence-based decision making, allowing basically to give an answer and go to decision maker and say, okay, it's not just it's better, it's in financial terms, this is what it leads to. So one question from the audience was, let me go exactly and read it actually. I'm working as a senior data scientist in consulting. What typical problems in organizations seem to be the best for causal inference?
Oh, yeah. I think that a big field is marketing. So a lot of the things in marketing are about causal inference. So really about all the campaigns that we are running in the organization, the promotions that we are doing, the targeting questions. Like I think that is a very big field. I think pricing as well. Pricing is a very relevant problem also in many areas of the business where we are trying to determine optimal prices of products. And usually this is also about understanding the impact that price changes would have on metrics that we care about, like sales. So yeah, I think that as well. Yeah, and also a lot of the customer experience, trying to optimize customer experience. If we want to sort of know what kind of actions we should take to make the customer experiences better, or we want to know whether something we've implemented, maybe a recommender system or something is actually working. Yeah, you're asking a causal question. So I think that those kinds of areas are very relevant.
Great example. Thank you. And one last short question about this POC approach for showing the value. Any tip of how to select the proper problem to showcase the causal capabilities? And I really like the follow-up, which is basically the tension between something where you're quite confident that you'll be able to solve and show the value, and also that it brings enough value. So you see,
Yeah.
you have, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so I think that value with value we quite quickly think of, okay, we need to find like a significant causal effect estimate or something that's very desirable to find or something like that. But I think of value a bit differently. So usually the main problem is that leadership is not convinced because they not really understand the sort of the gap in the company or why causal inference is really different. And I think that sort of this first pilot already delivers value if it can show to leadership that there's basically a gap between the evidence that we are currently gathering with our data and the business decisions we want to make. So this can be, for example, that our pilot shows that the usual analysis is actually addressing a different business question than the one we are trying to actually answer. And any sort of bridge we make from the analysis results to the business decision is extrapolation or based on assumptions that we don't document. Or it may show that the conclusion we would have from the causal analysis and the usual analysis are completely different. And we can explain that the usual analysis is misleading because it doesn't consider certain factors. Or I think that all of those are already examples of how causal inference, sort of the pilot, can show value because it shows them that sort of the evidence that we're currently using may be weaker or than we were expecting, and that causal inference can basically help to fill that gap.
Thank you very much. It was a very enriching talk. And now, of course, you can follow Jamilla and CausAI on LinkedIn and find all her courses online as well on her platform. And also, I wanted to add something. And you also train teams. So if there are
Yes.
companies here that need upskilling, they can contact you.
Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot.